I've played many Super Nintendo games, and honestly, I've played tons of games in general. And one of the things I've noticed, and I feel this might be a consensus view, is that as time goes on with these consoles, developers get more and more familiar in what they can do on a console. And more often than not, it's the later era releases on a system that tend to stand out. But sometimes the stars align and developers hit that sweet spot where they can pull off magic. And that's the topic of today's episode, the top 10 best looking Super Nintendo games. Let's begin. This is a game that pops up often for me because it consistently impresses me. For those of you who don't know, this is a joint venture between LucasArts and Konami. It's a run and gun, and it's a damn hard one too. Oftentimes, folks confuse it with another game, Cybernator, because in many ways, it plays the exact same way. We're in a mech, we're getting power-fisted by an incomprehensible amount of enemies, there's no user interface, so the only thing we really get to see is the action unfolding in front of us. The game itself involves us piloting one of 6 different mechs, Nitro, Havoc, Prometheus, Spider, Ballistic, and the Drash, each one having their own pros and cons. But what rocks about this game is that if we take too much damage, we can eject out of our mech and find another one. It's really dope. But I do want to bring attention to the artwork. The sprite work in this game is phenomenal. To me, it could easily pass as a very early PS1 game if you weren't aware that it was a Super Nintendo game. And we can thank the team of Chris Hockabout, Harrison Fong, and Jesse Clark. None of those names really stand out to me, but hey, this game looks incredible, great quality cutscenes, great action sequences, and it really impressed me. We see a game that perfectly encapsulates the gritty, futuristic aesthetic of mech space combat, and that meticulous attention to detail is something that I find to be critically underused by many developers. Oh no, Earthbound keeps showing up on my list, which is a constant reminder to me that I'm wrong about it being overrated. I'm gonna regret that decision once I realize that it's probably not that bad. You know, for how I feel about Earthbound being a wacky novel JRPG that is almost too eccentric for my taste, I do adore the art style. In fact, most of the creative elements, be it music and artwork, they're really warm, right? Like enveloping. The strange music that makes you feel comfortable but yet so uneasy because you know something bad is right around the corner, and Koichi Uyama's art really pops, it stands out. He draws things in such a way where all the elements sort of stick together, they make sense to me. For example, in some other Super Nintendo games, they don't put focus on the things that aren't directly in your line of sight. Think Super Mario World. The bushes look like bushes. Okay. But if Uyama had anything to do with it, each leaf would have its own definition. And I feel in some ways that was HAL Laboratory's artistic direction. Many of their games had this surreal, but still somewhat whimsical and imaginative blend applied to a comic-based look. And while I haven't had the time to see this game all the way through, I do look forward to checking it out. Lord knows the peer pressure stacks up every single episode. Oh, by the way, did you know that Uyama was one of the first illustrators for Pokemon trading cards? Now you know. I've always held Kirby in extremely high regards for quite a few things. The music is lofty and memorable, the character design is cute and relatable to the demographic that the difficulty is aimed for, and the overall art is a visual kiss on the forehead with tongue. Historically, Kirby has always had this vibrant palette, a colorful pixel design that paves the way for what we'll experience while we're in Dreamland. Now, much like Earthbound, this is a HAL Labs game as well. Kirby is their IP through and through. And while Uyama was the art lead for Earthbound, Tetsuya Natoya, as a graphical artist under his privy, led the charge for Kirby's Dream Land 3. And this wasn't his first HAL Labs game. In fact, he's got a rather strong history working for HAL Labs. His first game was Arcana, HAL's 1992 RPG. But to this day, he's maintained a strong presence working on the Kirby's franchise, all the way since Kirby's Dream Land that same year. And to me, this game is somewhat important as well. It needed to look decent because it was the last Super Nintendo game published by Nintendo in the United States. So people were ready for the next best thing. I know some of you might feel that this game looks too fuzzy, but this is Kirby. They messed around with art styles all the time, and I find this game in particular to be comfortable to me, if that makes sense. It's a very cozy game. Super Turrican 2 is one of those games that really makes the Super Nintendo work for its money. There's some technical prowess that really caught my eye. Now, it's not as sharp as I would expect, but there's a lot going on. Any game that used Mode 7 is a keeper for me, and to have smooth scaling and rotation with dynamic backgrounds that provide immersion and depth, that's monumental to me. Now, Super Turrican 2, it belongs to a long-standing franchise, one that dates all the way back to Turrican on the Commodore 64 in 1990. Factor 5 actually developed the Atari ST and Amiga versions, and for the most part, they were there for most of the entries in the series. Now, Super Turrican 2 has always been a neat blend of run and gun, platforming, and shooting elements. In fact, I think most people bill this as a shooter, but for those who love the badassness and grittiness of Contra, this was a great secondary option. Plus, it had music from Chris Hulsbeck, who in my opinion is one of the greatest composers in the retro gaming era. When you consider how many computer games tried to jump to the console market and failed, this is an example of when it's done right. I just really dig the aesthetic. Now, if you want to play this, unfortunately, you're going to have to shell out some money. It's really expensive, and I actually covered it in my top 10 practically expensive Super Nintendo episode, which I'll link down below and at the end of this video. Oh hey, look, another game I've yet to play fully. In some ways, I kind of dread making Super Nintendo videos because I know exactly which games people will respond with, and which ones people will be like, "What the fuck do you mean you haven't played it? You're such a gremlin! Get out of my house!" And you know, people have every right to feel that way. I've just never really cared about Metroid. To me, the artwork, music, and pretty much everything that makes Metroid appeal to me is pushed out by the fact that I'm dealing with what makes Metroid Metroid. That Metroidvania amount of action adventuring that bores the shit out of me. That being said, Super Metroid is a badass game that features some incredible sprite work from Hirofumi Matsuoka, Masahiko Mashimo, and Hiroyuki Kimura. And out of those three, Hirofumi-san and Hiroyuki-san both worked on previous Metroid games. Masahiko-san was more of a background artist, kind of helped out here and there. But one thing I want everyone to consider is that the art in Super Metroid is a masterclass in atmospheric design. It's haunting. It's a dreadful world, with corridors that seemingly never end, and we don't know what's coming next. We have a darker palette with shades of purple, blue, and green, and how these colors are implemented, it creates depth and mystery, a sort of foreboding atmosphere that carries the mood the entire game. And I appreciate that. It definitely deserves to be on this list. Oh, Square, you can recognize their work a mile away, be it the music, the dialogue, the game flow, and more importantly, the art. Actually, if we really want to get down to basics, Super Mario RPG Legend of the Seven Stars reeks of Square excellence. The only exception is instead of having those off-the-wall story arcs, it's Mario. Plain and simple, it's Mario. And to me, it's a funny little game, but the graphics are dope. I wasn't necessarily a fan of 3D rendered graphics, at least not to the capacity that most people would want on the Super Nintendo, because I do enjoy 2D artwork. And artists that manipulate the 2D artwork to feel like we're in a 3D environment, I guess 2.5D, they do it well. They've mostly always done it well. But the team on this game, Hideo Minaba, Kiyofumi Kato, and Yuko Hatai, did a great job with the world that this game takes place in. The animations of combat are fluid, there are fine details in the expressions of the characters' faces, and to be honest, they did better than I would have expected. Now obviously this started a pseudo-franchise, or technically two, Paper Mario, as well as Mario and Luigi. Both would spin off to continue the RPG-esque nature of it, while still having some elements of the original game. Super Mario RPG is unique in many ways, and one of them actually exists inside of the cartridge itself. This is one of 34 games that utilized the SA1 chip or Super Accelerator chip, and only 7 of those games were released outside of Japan. And if that's something you'd like to learn from me, feel free to let me know in the comments below. I love making unique niche videos about things you might not think about. Before we continue, I do want to point out that we are currently working towards a major milestone of 8,000 subscribers. And if we accomplish that, I'll make a special video of the community's choosing. Currently, roughly 67% of the folks watching my videos aren't subscribed, so feel free to join the community. It's a great time and I'd love to have you here. Let's get back to the action though. Oh boy, Donkey King! Now, if you've watched my previous episodes, you know I hate Donkey Kong Country. It's not because it's a bad game, it isn't, it's a platformer through and through. The thing that I despise about it is that I feel we're so zoomed in that we need incredible reflexes in later stages to even stand a chance. But let's look at Donkey Kong Country for what it is. A breath of fresh air into a franchise that was really stagnant. For those of you who don't know, Donkey Kong wasn't really doing well in 1983. Donkey Kong 3, the third arcade game, is oftentimes considered a massive commercial failure, and that's a failure that is shared with most of the arcade games that Nintendo was pumping out. And to me, it easily served as a catalyst for Nintendo to leave the arcade market. Also, Rare was sort of well established, and they had a penchant for good solid proof of concepts, and if there's anything Nintendo's horny for, it's proof of concepts that work. Because of their ability to work with the IP and create a cool concept, Nintendo allowed Rare to use the IP, and thus Donkey Kong Country was born. Now, the director of Donkey Kong Country, Tim Stamper, one of the founders of Rare, said that he really liked the attempts of using pre-rendered elements. He was specifically impressed by Mortal Kombat, and that played a large role into how the sprites worked inside of Donkey Kong Country. Rare just did it a little bit better to me. And because they did it better, we have one of the best pre-rendered graphical standards, if not the best, on the Super Nintendo. All you gotta do is phone up David Wise for music and you have one of the most successful games on the platform. I'm just not a huge fan of it. We've seen quite a few artistic approaches today. In-depth sprite work, cutesy, almost fuzzy animations, pre-rendered sprites. But what about hand-drawn pictures converted with pixel approximation? Now what the fuck does that mean? For anyone who hasn't dabbled in the doodle like I have, pixel approximation is basically taking an image that you've drawn, scanning it, and then converting it pixel by pixel into a work of art. But it's a little bit more complicated than coloring in say a color book. The beauty of pixel approximation is that you get to choose what colors you use, and by using slight variations in the source color, we can create subtle gradients, or blending by definition. Modern pixel art is insane, but back then pixel art was the way to do it. There really wasn't another way, and the sprite work ultimately depended on artists being able to discern how to make their images stand out. In Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, the entire game's art execution is phenomenal. It's truly a testament to the abilities of Yoshiaki Koizumi and Hisashi Nogami. Yoshiaki-san in particular would go on to be the 3D system designer for Ocarina of Time, so he's already like a personal hero to me. Let me tell you, those scribbled cartoon backgrounds, I love that aesthetic. As a kid I loved it, and as an adult I appreciate it. But I will say, Baby Mario irritates the fuck out of me, so this game hit all the bases for everything I needed in my life. Well, now that you've seen this, you've probably figured out what the next one is. And it's kind of unavoidable. Realistically, the top two games on this list could be viewed as interchangeable. They both are from the same company, they're both RPGs, and they are both games that exist on an equal platform when we discuss some of the best Super Nintendo games out there. But for me, Final Fantasy III is ever slightly so lower. Now don't get it twisted, I adore this game. Final Fantasy VI to me is the perfect JRPG. The mixture of epic music from Nobuo Uematsu, the production direction of Hironobu Sakaguchi, Ken Narita's programming, Yoshinori Kitase's dialogue, and a dream team of epic artists made this game the golden standard of 16-bit JRPGs. That, in my opinion, has never been superseded. And you'd be hard-pressed to find one that's better, other than spot number one, but again, they're interchangeable. I feel like I have to throw this disclaimer out there. Speaking of the artwork, there are a few folks on it, but the ones that matter are Tetsuya Takahashi, Kazuko Shibuya, and Yoshitaka Amano. Now, Yoshitaka Amano is a character designer. Anytime you see the badass legendary artwork on a box art from the early games in Final Fantasy, or any character development artwork, that's him. Kazuko Shibuya has damn near always been associated with Final Fantasy, and Tetsuya Takahashi mostly works on Xenosaga games. When you have a game that's so in-depth to current issues like rebellion, redemption arcs, loss of hope, and the intrinsic search to find peace, warfare, things that usually aren't touched in video games, the ability to make artwork pop like they managed to do really nails it home. Final Fantasy VI, it's not a game, it's an experience, and I would die to experience it mentally, for the first time again, and that's something I can never do. Well, did you get it right? Chrono Trigger, again, it's 50-50 on if it's the best game on the Super Nintendo, but I guess I can yield to the idea that it is a different style of RPG than Final Fantasy VI. It's more so an action RPG, but even if Chrono Trigger was a turn-based RPG, I think I would enjoy it just as much. The big reason I wanted to place this at number 1 is because the artist that made this happen is no longer with us, and he was a major part of so many aspects of our lives, and more often than not, we didn't think about it. Akira Toriyama, that's his name, and for the anime and manga kids, he created Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball. For the retro gamers, his artwork was present in Dragon Quest, Chrono Trigger, and Blue Dragon, which many of you probably haven't played, and his impact on society was massive. Not only in Japan, but around the world. And when he died at 68, we lost a major component of the history of manga. I would say on par with Osamu Tezuka. Much like Final Fantasy VI, literally every aspect of Chrono Trigger is perfect. After all, it was created by the literal dream team. Sakaguchi leading the charge, Yuji Horii writing the dialogue, Yasunori Mitsuda composing beautiful and earth-shaking tunes, and of course, Toriyama-san creating timeless characters like Frog, Magus, Chrono, Marl, and Luca in his traditional "this is probably the same person with a different haircut" style that we know from Dragon Ball Z. It's 2024 though. If you haven't played Chrono Trigger, do me a favor, boot it up, and prepare to enter a world of varying emotions and design, from a modern everyday world to a world that time forgot, with so many more steps along the way. Each portion of the game has its own aura, and because of the Dream Team, it worked perfectly. Artwork is great. And that's it for today. What did you think of this list? What do you believe are the best looking Super Nintendo games out there? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below, and I'm sure the rest of the community would love to as well. If you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're a group of individuals who love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live. And if that's a vibe that you enjoy, then feel free to join us. I'd love to have you here. Finally, the single most important thing you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the projects and the videos that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.